Well, I was back on my way to... Iraq. That God-forsaken country. In early August of 2021, this was only weeks before the U.S.'s disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, well, they did have a movie playing on the Umbrella aircraft that they flew me over in, but, I mean, after the movie was over, there wasn't really much for me to do. So, I decided to read my notes on the presentation that I was about to give the STARS agents as soon as I landed in Baghdad. Apparently it's Baghdad, not Baghdad, but who cares, okay? I mean, I guess the natives care, but it doesn't really matter to me. Or just about any American. Anyway, so I had basically assigned myself to go to this one open field that was in between two mountain passes. And it was always a strange geographical clearing, because that's what it was. It was a clearing where it had mountains on all sides of it. It was a very strange place to have a farm, but there was a farm. There was the farmer was named Sahim Ottoman, and he had a worker that worked on the farm with him named Mufasa. Yes, his real name is Mufasa. It's Arabic for king. But anyway, that place had a real tragic history, because right where it was standing, according to ancient Babylonian folklore, there used to be a temple there dedicated to the god Ishtar. And it was located near the city of Akkadiya. And one day it mysteriously, according to folklore, just sunk into sands below the mountains. And it was very strange for it to do that, because, you see, on that particular day, there was a group of Akkadian soldiers, and they had just escorted an Urian, a type of Urian lieutenant, into the temple to be sacrificed, because, yes, the high priest to Ishtar did commit human sacrifice, and, well, I'm gonna theatrically bring this out to, well, I theatrically brought it out to, basically kill some time while I was on the plane. And this is what supposedly happened all the way back in 2003 BC. So, by the arm, a stout Akkadian soldier drags the Urian right in front of the chief guard of the temple of Ishtar. It was during the time where they were at war, Akkad and the city of Ur were, and in his elegant robe and rather creepy-looking golden mask with a long golden beard, that was part of the mask, of course, the high priest declared, "Ishtar will be most pleased with you." And then the high priest said, "Quickly, Balathu," who was the chief guard's name, "tie this Urian down." And so they put him down on an altar of some things, and the high priest said, "Why do you hesitate? Haven't you killed many before in the wars, and the wars of the past, and likely will in the war of the future?" And Balathu looked over at him and said, "Yes, I have, my lord, but I don't think I've ever killed someone so defenseless." And the high priest said, "'Tis what needs to be done." And this altar was located on an area where a beam of sunlight was just fading below the mountains, and the moon was starting to come out. And when the moon beam struck the victim, so would the high priest's knife. And then, suddenly, out of nowhere, a loud screeching sound could be heard. It was almost like a hissing sound. And so the stout guard of Arcadia armed himself. And then there was a shaking feeling. And then this giant stone temple started to creak and almost sway a little bit. And then the stout guard beside Balathu said, "I shall go investigate." And he grabbed his spear and shield and ran. And then he flew open to the gate, to the main hall, and then out stepped these horrifying creatures. They almost looked like giant bats. They had giant wings and giant fangs and red eyes. And they let out a horrifying hiss. And so the guard raised his spear and then tried to jab, and then with their long bat wings pulled the spear away and pounced on him. And then he howled as they drew the blood from his body and started to eat. And during that commotion, the poor Urian prisoner was able to grab the high priest's knife and cut himself free from the altar. And then the high priest just stared at him. And he said, "You will weep what you sow." And then Balathu, doing his job, pulled out his sword and pointed right at the Urian. And then Balathu looked back and saw that those giant bat creatures would soon be done eating the guard, and they would soon be coming for them. And then the high priest stepped forward and said, "'Tis the will of the gods that you shall leave, and we shall be protected." And then the bats hoisted him high in the air with their wings, and then started to devour his throat, soaking his golden mask in blood. And then both Balathu and the Urian ran into the dark corners. And then, once again, Balathu raised his sword, and the Urian raised his dagger. But Balathu was very reasonable, and he explained, I know we may be enemies, but even enemies can have respect for one another. I think you and me face a common enemy, and if you would just help me defeat them, I think we could both get out of here. Let's get out of here. 2 monsters and 2 men. Please, join me. Or fight both by yourself. And then the Urian said, how do I know I can trust you? And Balathu said, if mankind ever faced any kind of enemy, and they are not able to come together, then there is no hope for us. And with that, they agreed. And then they ran. And using the teamwork, they were able to slice the throats and then stab them right in the middle of the chest where their presumed hearts were. And then they thanked each other for help. And they shook hands. And the Urian went back to Ur to tell the story. And Balathu went back to Akkad. And it became sort of a Good Samaritan style story. You know, the Good Samaritan story from the Bible. That's kind of what it became. So, yeah, I gave it a happy ending, even though I'm not really sure if it did have a happy ending in real life. And, I had just heard over the intercom that we were starting to land. I remember touching down in that airport, and I stepped out, and the hot, dry air immediately dried me out. And the hot, stinging sand I felt on my cheek. And I thought, why the hell is stars making me wear a pair of thin jeans, boots, a Stars officer's jacket, along with a shirt underneath? Why? And I also had to carry a backpack and a side pistol. But after that, it was my job to get to this particular Stars outpost, and then, well, talk to my wife, because I hadn't seen her in over 10 weeks and 2 days. I got into a helicopter piloted by a nice helicopter pilot named Barry, and we chewed the rag a little while he flew me over. And then we landed, and he said, all right, anything else you need helicopter related, don't hesitate to call me, Ethan. And also, remember, go for late night drives with your daughter. It worked with mine. And I just politely said, thank you, Barry, waved, and left. And then I entered what was a hollowed out Iraqi villa that some oil mogul or Saddam Hussein, take your pick, had once owned. Perhaps both. And then I was greeted by Captain Kolchak. I was an 04 and he was an 05. And he said in his southern drawl, and said, glad you're here. First Lieutenant. And with you here, we might actually be able to get to go home soon, so, you don't know how happy I am to see you. Here, let me show you the place. And might I say, it was a beautiful, like, old Persian-style temple that was turned into somebody's home. I honestly wouldn't have minded staying there if it wasn't for the heat. But to make up for it, there was a pool right in the middle of the villa, and I could see both Dylan and Jake playing some sort of game. I think they were trying to splash each other. Yeah, it was cool. And then he brought me into a big meeting room and said, "Alright, okay, so I've just called in Staff Sergeant Upshur. I assume she's related to you. And our old friend, Sergeant Chris." And I got so excited. I was giddy for her to just walk through that door. And then I saw her walk through the door, and she said, "What are you doing here?" "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm here to help my wife." Aren't you, Aren't you happy to see me? Like, how did you not know I was coming? And Chris interjected and said, "Oh, wait, I didn't think to tell Mia because I thought you had called her." And I said, "Well, I tried to call her, but she doesn't pick up. You know, Rose has really missed you, Mia." "What?" And then Chris looked at her and said, "Wait, hold on. You mean to tell me that you left this man alone with his baby for over 2 months and you rarely ever call?" Wow. That's low, Mia. That's pretty low. And Captain Kolchak came in and said, "I'm sorry, should I leave?" And Chris said, "You know what? Yeah, why don't we give the married couple some time alone?" And I said, "Well, Mia, aren't you happy to see me?" And she said, well, yes, I am happy to see you again, but I want to see you after this mission was done." And I said, well, why don't you want me helping you? Because I needed someone to stay behind with Rose. And I said, you know, you could have just asked Stars to hire another agent to get on this here mission. You could have just did that. Why didn't you? And he said, Mia said, well, and I said, you didn't want to be alone with Rose either, did you? And she said, well, no, Ethan, I didn't. But, come on, can you blame me? And I said, yes, Mia, I can blame you. And she said, well, I'm sorry, I just needed some time to myself. Away from me? I said, and she said, well, yes, I needed just a little bit of time away from you, but let's just get this mission over with, and then after that, we can go home and talk about it, okay? I would really like for us to remain professional. Alright, okay. And then, dressed in They're brown camo with black dots in them. You see, they called them chocolate chips. And wearing light brown t-shirts. Both Jake and Dylan came in and hugged me a little bit and said, "It's good to see you, Ethan. We're glad you're here. Glad you're here." And I said, "Because of me, we get to go home soon." And and Dylan said, "Oh, thank you. I'm not sure how much longer of getting dried out I can take." And Jake, in his boyish way, said, "Oh, what? The sand too much for you?" Nah, I love this. I get to see some action all the time." And Dylan said, Shut up, Jake. You do not." And Jake said, "Well, like hell I do. Like, remember when I stopped that, at the check?" And then he trailed off and said, "Oh, okay, you know, it's best that we don't talk about it." And I said, "Wait, don't talk about what? Like the checkpoint?" And he said, "No." Dylan said, No, let's just not talk about it." And then Chris came back in, along with a combat medic, and he was actually a really nice guy. And a man who wasn't so nice, but was still a character all the same, was a man named Boris. And yeah, he was a real character. He was a Hispanic fella, and he, from the way he looked and smelled, he had just came back from bench pressing. And he's like, "Hey man, I just lifted me 210. Yeah." And he flexed his muscles and said, all right, pencil pusher. Where's this thing we're supposed to get to?" And Jake said, "My man, Boris." Yeah, he was a cocky E4 in stars, but I didn't really mind much. I mean, he was, I guess you can say he was a mean fighting machine. And then I gave them the rundown of what was happening. I said, this area that we're looking for has a bad track record of terrible and rather supernatural things happening. And my satellite scans show that there is this big chasm, almost chamber-like thing that is underneath this land. And I think it is safe to assume that someone is hiding something under there. And I think the man who owns the property, Salim Othman, is our culprit. So, what we are to do is we are to fly in on the helicopter, basically come in, take the property, and go underground to see what is under there and what we do from there. That understood? And then Boris raises his hand and said, Yeah. Will we be going to the gift shop afterwards? Do I even have to answer? And Captain Kolchak came in and said, all right, knock it off. Knock it off, Boris. All right. And then, after that, I just explained the mission, and we were done. And then I talked to Mia again, and I said, okay, Mia, I know that you want to keep it professional, and I will do the best of my abilities, but I really missed you, Mia. And she looked at me and said, well, I miss you too, Ethan.